Marcy Belfi. Where's Marcy? She's right over there. We have Brian Stewart. Where's Brian?
Right here.
He's over here. And we have Kent Litcott. Okay, and he's right here. And we have a short video that's going to be shown. Where is... Okay, here he is. Tell me your name.
Jack Albert.
Jack Albert. Okay, Jack Albert's going to show us a short video at the very end. I'm going to start off today. We're going to go in the order that is seen here. And then I think probably the best thing for us to do is to have the sessions, each session come along. I think we'll have a break in between, yes, with Jessica. Yeah, we will have a break in between. So why don't we do this? We'll have the two sessions first, and then we'll have the break, the next two sessions, and then we'll have a little panel that comes up, and people will talk about collectively what we've been doing, and you all get a chance to ask some questions. But if you have some burning questions beforehand, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. Okay. I teach at a community college in Fall River, Massachusetts, so I'm going to go rather quickly through some of these slides. As you see, my presentation is the practical economics for the Anthropocene, educating for resilience. And I teach at a community college, southeastern Massachusetts. We have 4 campuses in e-learning. How many people here work at a community college or have taught at a community college? Okay, so we have a few people. And are people still teaching at a community college now? Is there anyone still teaching at a community college? Okay. How many people, I'm sure there are some of the people who are from other countries, may not know the community college system. How many people really feel as though they know the community college system? Okay, so I'm going to give you a little background to help us all be on the same page. Okay. So here are some demographics. In the United States, there are 980 public community colleges. Some are tribal, 35 are tribal, 88 are independent, and we have over 1,100 community colleges in the country. This is a very surprising figure to some people. 41% of all undergraduate students in the United States are in community colleges. 41%. And actually that's down over the last couple of years, but a full 41%. It's stacked with women, 56% versus 44. 40% of the students are first-time freshmen, and 36% are first-time first generation in their family going to college. These are the age categories. The average age is 28, the median age is 24. 51% is 21 or under, so this is really a non-traditional population that's coming in. 22 to 39 years old, 39%, and 40 years or plus, 10%. So we have an older population in general that comes to the community college. We have a lot of ethnic and diversity, racial diversity at the colleges. As you see here, Native American 56, Hispanic 52, and so forth. Matriculation, 59% are attending for credit. They're full-time, 37%, and part-time, 62%. And we have a lot of non-credit students coming. In other words, they're not getting credit, but they're there to get some kind of training or some kind of information to help them with their jobs, so 41%. The associate degrees that were granted in the 2016-2017 period of time, it was 8,033, as you see, and for certificates, over 5,000.
What's the difference?
A certificate is a shorter term. It won't. The usual credit accumulation is 60 credits, but in the state of Massachusetts, you can't be above 29 credits and call it a certificate. So it's a certificate program, which means that, a lot of people come in and they may be a social worker, but for instance, they come into my program, the Sustainability Studies program, to get sustainability information to take back to their jobs. So one is the degree and one is...
you said 5,000 is 533. Right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, 533,000. Right? Okay. Public community colleges are the best bang for the buck. The average cost is about $3,500 a year. Even the public four-year colleges and universities are far more than that. And of course, coming to a private college or a private university, I don't know what the cost for Wells is, something like 39 or so
Yeah,
thousand.
it's about $40,000.
40,000. If you look at a place like Harvard, it's more like 65 to 70,000 dollars a year. So, and by the way, I live in an area that's a relatively poor area. Taunton, New Bedford, and Fall River are the three main cities. They once were among the richest countries in the world. Okay? With whaling in New Bedford, textiles in Fall River, and silversmithing in Taunton. But all of them, obviously, those industries have declined, and so it's a relatively poor area. So the sustainability studies program that we developed took 4 years to get off the ground. We finally got it started this past fall. And it basically has throughout the entire program an understanding that we're in a paradigm shift with 4 interrelated realities that are inescapable. Climate change with global warming, finite resource depletions, with the most major one being fossil fuels. We have the reality of the end of growth, which means we have to fundamentally transform into a different type of economic system, and relocalization. And there are 2 interrelated prerequisites for all of this if humankind is to be part of Earth's future. Humankind must consciously re-enter the space of nature, and we must recognize and actualize ways of living that coincide with the limits of nature. Now the program is it's a liberal arts / sustainability studies program. There's 9 core courses, 6 of which were brand new that we developed, and 3 existing courses that we pulled in. And then you have to go into a track. You can either go into education or engineering, environmental studies. You see what they are here. And the idea is that you take 3 courses, prescribed courses for each track, for one of those tracks. Each student gets to choose 1 track. You take the courses within that track, and you apply your sustainability knowledge from the social science basis. That's something I didn't emphasize. What's really important about this program is it comes from the social sciences. It's not in environmental studies, it's not in engineering, but it's from social science. So then you take the social science information and you apply it to engineering or hospitality, ocean science, and so forth. And here are the courses, the core courses. Sustainability and Humankind's Dilemma, Life on a Tough New Planet, which talks about all of the problems that we have facing us. And of course, at the end of the semester, students are really depressed, and they're wondering, you know, what they should do besides kill themselves. And so the next semester is Resilient Sustainability, Preparing for the Future. And we talk about all kinds of things that people around the world are doing that are existing. They're not things that we might hope to do, but they're things that are happening in the world that people are doing that makes a difference. And then sustainability from 12 different perspectives, 12 faculty. There are 12 different faculty who teach this course. And each one of them gets 1 week to talk about the problems within his or her discipline and the solutions that people are coming up with in that area. So we have everything from culinary arts to criminal justice, to health sciences, to sociology, to media, to what else do we have in there? Agriculture, physics, and so forth. And then the next course, science and versus pseudoscience, helping students to understand when you read something, when you're looking at charts, when you're listening to information, how do you assess what that information, how valid that information is. And then eco-literacy, education, and society, which pulls together the idea that people fundamentally have to have eco-literacy in their life from very young ages all the way up through the life stages. And then sustainability, human rights, and climate change. We have a lot of inequalities that are taking place in the world, and they're only going to heighten, I think, as the constraints become tighter on us. And we're not going to make it on this planet if we don't have climate justice, if we don't have social justice. And we've got to figure out how we're going to do that. So we talk about those issues. That course has yet to be taught. That's coming up this coming fall. Whoops. And then the economics class, sustainable economics, which I'll talk about more in a moment, the rise of the new economy. Then environmental sociology, looking at the built environment. And then finally, the last course that people have to take is a civic engagement course where they take all of the sustainability knowledge that they've gained and apply it to some agency, organization out in the community. So these are the track courses. I'm going to go through these quickly. Education, engineering, environmental studies and health sciences, hospitality, ocean science, sustainable agriculture. We're one of the few community colleges in the country that has a program where you can actually get a degree in sustainable agriculture. And then water and water management. So, the course, Sustainable Economics, the Rise of the New Economy. Now, first of all, I have to say, this is not all solidly in place. This is all in flux. I'm still trying to figure out what this course is going to look like. And as I said, this fall is the first time that's going to be taught, and I'm the one who's teaching it. So this is the course description. I'll read it for you. The course focuses on the contradictions within contemporary capitalism, their impacts on the physical and human environment, and the emerging economic transformation. Issues addressed include the future of economic growth and globalization, biophysical constraints, impacts on consumer society, the rise of natural and human capital, steady state, gift and shared economics, participatory budgeting, relocalization of labor, cooperatives and worker-owned production, emerging small businesses, development of local and regional currencies, bioregional productions, and alternative finance and banking systems. So, and I hope to figure that out by September. Okay, so the fundamental, my fundamental orientation in this is that here we are, we're human society, and we have treated ourselves as though we're separate from nature. We're humans, and then there's nature. And we use it when it's reasonable for us to use it, when we think we need to be exploiting it and so forth. But we're separate from nature. And throughout the entire program, I put humans back into nature. So we have human society, but human society cannot function without economy, and economy cannot function without nature. Virtually everything in this room, everything we touch, everything we do has its origins in nature. It may be 2, 5, 20, 100 times removed, but there is nothing that we have or we do that's not connected with nature. So the road to resilient sustainability. Biophysical and reintegration within nature, and conservation, relocalization, democratization, and renewable energy will get us to economic stabilization, and I think ultimately climate stabilization. So the biophysical reintegration with nature. There's 2 areas that we really focus on. The fact that we need to re-enter the space of nature, that's one. And the second, because of peak oil and other resource depletions, we have to think about and actualize ways of creating new ways of doing what we need to have done. So, degeneration of Earth's soils, destruction of natural capital, degreening the planet. We've been really good at it. Deforestation of grasslands and wetland destruction. Industrial agriculture has really, really done us in. And overpaving and overbuilding on soil. Urbanization and transport systems have done us in as well. We've benefited from them, but we're paying a price. The ecological results is soil depletion, mismanaged, degreened, decarboned, and dehydrated. Disruption of Earth's carbon cycle, disruption of Earth's water cycle, and disruption of Earth's weather patterns. The result, excess CO2 in Earth's atmosphere, heating the planet, and climate change. The soil carbon sponge. It's only fairly recently that I have come to know the work of Walter Jenner, but I have such an enormous respect for him. I hadn't planned on having a co-presenter for this session, but I've decided to have this co-presenter because I have some video from a session that he did at Tufts University in October of 2015. So I'm going to click on this, and And it runs for about 20 minutes, but I'm going to give him my 20 minutes. Okay. So this is Walter Yenna at Tufts University.
Brian and Susan for looking after it. And very
He's an
valuable
Australian
chat.
microbiologist.
Let's hope this weekend we can continue that, not just talking here, but then in the workshops. Bit of background, Healthy Soils Australia. We're an NGO, but we're in a sense a network. We connect to 500, 1,000 very, very leading, innovative farmers and activists in Australia in this whole business of land regeneration. We work with all levels, you know, like most of it down grassroots, innovative farmers, but also up in politics. Our ex-Governor General, you know, that's like the Queen in Australia, when he retired, Major General Michael Jeffrey, he sort of said, look, there's one fundamental thing we must do globally for the future, and that's restore our landscape. And so in a sense he invited us to come on board as the sort of scientific face. And so yeah, we talk into politics at the very, very highest level. Of course they always say yes, 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 but really that's not where the action is. The action is with the grassroots, with you, the people on the ground, because politics is necessary, but the real bottom line is what are the grassroots actions, what are we doing to deliver change where it's critically needed. And as far as critical need, of course, the real issue there is, in a sense, what are we doing in terms of this whole climate crisis, but not climate per se, but the impacts of climate in terms of water, food, habitat, and of course that translates to social stability. And it's really, that's a critical issue, because a crunch will come down that cascade: water, food, habitat, biosystems collapse, social collapse. It's happening now, different parts of the world, and really we've got 10 years, because if we don't, we're going to see, do we lose the means to do that? So it's quite a serious strategic issue, and big news, the positive news is, of course, there are wonderful solutions. But just going into the climate story, just very rapidly scaling down to sort of put it into context, obviously, yeah, the climate's been there for 4.6 billion years. And in a sense, we can look at it and what are the processes that are governing, and that's what's important. But in a sense, our recent climate debate started perhaps in 1958, 1962, and of course Charles Keeling in Hawaii then confirmed, yes, here is CO2 going up. But Charles Keeling also confirmed that it's not just CO2 going up, but you've seen the sawtooth graph. CO2 goes up dramatically every winter in the northern hemisphere as carbon dioxide is released, but every summer, every spring, it comes back down again as green plants draw in carbon and fix it as sugars and cellulose. And so the whole CO2 dynamic, the message that Charles Keeling gave us was the sawtooth, not just CO2 rising, the balance between emissions and drawdown, the balance between our use of carbon and the biosequestration of carbon by biosystems. And it's that balance that we've in a sense disturbed, and when we think of balances, that's something that we can address. So it's a question, how do we restore that balance? But then in 2005, we got another very serious awakening. Jochen Schellenhuber, big conference in Exeter in UK, and they more or less made the point that, look, things are happening now. Climate extremes, dangerous climate extremes were actually already occurring, and they would accelerate because there's a whole lot of positive feedbacks in the climate system. And these feedbacks were going to lead to things like, yes, more intense storms. And of course you've had them, Sandy and what have you. But in a lot of the world, systemic aridification. You know, how do we actually change rainfall patterns? We've had that since the mid-70s in our Western Australian regions, and you're experiencing that now in California. These are systemic, long-term aridification patterns, and yes, they are at a global scale, they are locked in. And of course, these are all hydrological. And that's the other big message from Keeling, but from the whole climate story. CO2 won't kill us. You know, submariners die when CO2 gets to 10,000 parts per million. But it's not CO2, but it's actually hydrology, you know, that gives life, but it's also hydrology that kills. And in a sense, these extremes, these positive feedbacks, are hydrological. So in a sense, that sort of changes the whole context a little bit. What is it that we can do to avoid these hydrological extremes? And in a sense, that's the paradigm shift that we here this weekend, but in the wider agenda, have to sort of say, look, can we address this problem as nature does on a much more holistic basis? The facts are very clear. We are not going to be able to change and solve this this climate problems through just emission reductions. The sad truth now is we're not even going to change it by just drawing down carbon. Because the oceans, for example, they contain 38,000 billion tonnes of carbon. It's a massive buffer, and as we draw down carbon, the oceans re-equilibrate carbon back into the air. So it's going to take hundreds of years, and we don't have hundreds of years before these dangerous climate extremes impact. So the bottom line is we've got to find something much smarter. We've actually got to actively and safely and naturally cool the climate. And so we've got to change the narrative, we've got to change the debate, the whole inquiry of solutions into how do we actively, safely cool. And in a sense, that's our challenge here today. And it's really quite daunting in a way, but actually when we change the paradigm, it's also very empowering. Because now we can go back to nature to say, well, look, how did nature cool the planet? How did it naturally regulate the climate? And of course, when we go back to climatology 101, and you know, a lot of us did that, and before the whole global warming debate, and of course, we come to the reality, and it's still there today, that it's actually water. It's the dynamic process of water that governs 95% of the heat dynamics of this blue planet. Okay, and basically water's always been ignored in the recent climate debate because it was assumed that it was so dominant. Because it is so dominant, we humans could not have possibly influenced it to change the climate. So our human-induced climate change was always assumed to be due to CO2. But really, if we've got to cool the planet, we've got to ask the question, have we altered that hydrological heat dynamics? Can we use that to actually help us safely, naturally cool the climate? It's a relatively simple thing if we look at it at that global, bigger picture level. If we actually see that, we've got a sun, and that sun is constantly radiating incident solar radiation onto Earth. At the top of the troposphere, you know, the top of our dominant atmosphere, it's basically 342 watts per square metre of incident solar energy coming in. And our climate's being regulated by 342 watts of energy going back out. But because of our changes to the climate, we are now retaining an extra 3 watts per square metre in the Earth's atmosphere. And that's in a sense global warming. That's what we call the greenhouse effect. And so our challenge is how do we retransmit an additional 3 watts per square metre back out to space. That's less than 1% of that global heat dynamics. So the question in context is, look, it's a 1% systems change. And so while it's obviously at a bigger global scale now, it's a 1% rebalancing of heat dynamics. Can we, by managing the hydrology of the planet, do that safely and naturally? There's another very important thing here. This is a safely and naturally, because we've got another scenario coming on, and this is geoengineering. Because if we don't find a solution here, will we get into that Faustian trade-off to say, no, we have to artificially engineer the climate and start putting pollutants up there. And really, it's a very, very unknown, dangerous, risky consequence. And so can we by all means avoid that by doing it naturally? Okay, and so really what we're trying to talk about, what are the processes that govern the natural heat dynamics of this planet? You know, that 342 watts in and out. How have we changed those natural processes? And in a sense, what can we do to restore those processes? And in a sense, what we're saying here are the potential tools that we have in managing landscapes to do that restoration. Coming back to the punchlines, right up front, the answer is yes we can, right? Yes we can, in a sense, cool this planet safely, naturally, that 3 watts per square metre. Yes we can buffer the extremes that would the hydrological extremes that would otherwise create that crisis. Yes we can draw down carbon through these processes to more than offset the 10 billion tonnes carbon net emissions we've got now. So in a sense, the headline statements I want to say is, yes, there are safe, natural ways. The only thing that's challenging is, can we do it in time? But that's why the urgency and that's why the empowerment of grassroots action in this is so important. Specifically for America, and I'm not here to tell you, of course, in America what has to or could be done, but you've got a fundamental challenge now. You see, you've lost the snowpack on the Sierra Nevadas. It's basically gone. I mean, it'll come back a little bit, but you're going to be threatened with that all the way. So can we find alternative, water capture, water harvesting options, rainfall harvesting options to replace that snowpack? Because 40% of your green food depends on that. Can we manage our forests? So not like this year, that you can avoid those primary forests burning, degrading, and being destroyed. So these are things, and the answer again is yes, we can, but what it means is that we have to change the whole paradigms on which we're thinking and the tools that we're using, because we're not going to do it just by token marginal reductions in emissions. And it's those tools then that we want to talk about, right? What is it that we have to do? What is this range of what are actually 10 hydrological processes that nature uses and that we too can get into, right? And the first primary stepping stone, and it's again so simple, so elegant, and you'll see the logic as we go through these 10, and that's really, how do we restore the Earth's soil carbon sponge? Okay, because if we're talking about managing hydrology, the issue is how do we actually have the water that's available on the land to do these hydrological cooling processes. So the first step is, how do we rebuild the Earth's soil carbon sponge to provide the water for these cooling processes? The second step then is again very logical and simple, because if we've got water in the sponge, then we've got the potential for transpiration, for green plants to take that water and transpire it through their leaves and basically take that water back up into the upper atmosphere. And what is important, that every gram of water that's transpired by those leaves takes up to 600 calories of heat energy from the surface back up into the upper atmosphere, from where it can get dissipated back out to space. So those trees are actually a powerful hydrological air conditioning system. And in a sense, Michael talks about this in the small water cycle, or that point of the latent heat fluxes of heat from the surface going back up into the atmosphere to cool that surface. And it's prodigious, because basically on average 24% of the incident solar radiation naturally gets transpired through these latent heat fluxes up into the upper atmosphere. And we have fundamentally changed that process by degrading and deforestation vast areas, 75% of the Earth's forests, and we've created 5 billion hectares of man-made desert over the last 10,000 years, so we've fundamentally changed the surface. I'll go quickly through the other ones. There's a whole series, but actually I have a discussion paper that we can put on, the websites and stuff, where we go through each of these, the science behind each of these processes, and also on Sunday. So on Sunday, if people are interested, we can actually have a workshop and detailed questions and answers on all of them. Okay, so basically it's extending the longevity of green growth to keep.
Okay, I'm going to cut it off there, but basically what Jenna is talking about is fundamentally regreening the planet. That we've been looking in the wrong places for where carbon's at in the atmosphere. And we're saying, we've got to conserve, we've got to conserve, we've got to conserve. And guess what? We're not conserving, we're not conserving, we're not conserving. At the Mauna laboratory, just a few weeks ago, we found that it was up to 410 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. A year ago, it was 406 parts per million. Climatologists tell us there's 350 parts per million that we should be no higher than. And James Hansen, who's probably the foremost climatologist in the world, says it's 300 parts per million. So the issue is, I mean, when we're thinking about this course and this program, there are the two critical things. One is climate change, the other is peak oil. Peak oil really messes our lives up because we have to just reorient all kinds of things. But climate change could ultimately mean extinction. And that's why I put so much focus on climate change at the beginning of our whole program and thinking about this. And then we move into peak oil, and so we fundamentally have to rearrange everything that we do, including re-entering ourselves into nature so that we understand weather patterns, water patterns, the fact that we've messed up the carbon cycle, and as a result, we've messed up the water cycle of the planet, and as a result, we're getting massive storms in some places and massive droughts in others with all the fires and so forth. So how do I go? How can I move from here? Okay, so that was the climate change story, or the carbon soil story. And now we have the peak oil story. And I don't think I really need to go into that story here because I suspect that the vast majority of everyone knows the peak oil story. We're in deep doo-doo, okay? And as we talked about yesterday, as Charlie was talking about yesterday, we're not getting the kind of information out there in the world understanding how much doo-doo we really are in terms of the depletion of fossil fuels. And the urgency of our recreating systems to accommodate that reality. Okay, so what must we do? Well, we need to build economic, natural, and social capital. And we can do that first and foremost by agriculture, by soil regeneration, creating nutrient density and rehydration that helps not only with agriculture, obviously, but with the planet in terms of the water system. We talk about in this class the CSAs, community-supported agriculture, farmers markets, farm stands, urban farming, guerrilla gardening, all of these things that you see, and how to get these things up and running.
What's a guerrilla garden?
A guerrilla garden is where you see space that's been vacant for a period of time, and you decide you're going to take it over and grow something. Okay, and we can do that all through community college training. Through the degree and certificate programs, we actually have a sustainable agriculture program at the college. Through master gardener programs, which are non-credit, but it teaches ordinary citizens how to think about soil, water, seed, and so forth. Food awareness, we have a couple of generations that are unaware of what food is and where it comes from. You know, a salad is something that's in a plastic bag that's already there, and salad dressing is something in a bottle, and you've made a salad. There's not, it's something as simple as a salad becomes, you know, these packaged items. And then, of course, cooking classes. You have a vegetable and you think, what the hell do I do with this thing, right? We have to get people understanding how to deal with food. We need to create cooperatives, producer cooperatives. And these deal with farming, fishing, forestry, lumber, carpentry, and so forth. And worker cooperatives. The next job, once I leave this job in about 5 years, my next job is to go into worker cooperatives and get some programs up and running in the community so that people own the work that they're doing. That work is not going to be sent out to another country, outsourced. People are not going to foul their environment, and they'll have job security. And as you see, there's several other types of cooperatives, and it's a growing movement in the United States. It's far from being dominant, obviously, but when we look at credit unions, for instance, more than 9,000 people, 9,000 credit unions across the country. How many people here belong to a credit union? Okay, I really urge people to join a credit union, because you're keeping money in your community when you do that. Okay? The benefits of co-ops. It builds community, creates local networks, it democratizes ownership in sectors of the economic exchange, it generates local wealth, it fosters ecological best practices, it localizes consumption and production. You know, every time we go and buy something at Target or Home Depot, that money's out of the community. It's no longer within our community. It provides opportunities for education, training, and information sharing, and it stabilizes employment. And then we also need to facilitate small-scale enterprises, individual, family, and co-owner enterprises. And we can do that through slow money, the Grameen Bank. Is everyone familiar with the Grameen Bank?
No.
You have to be poor to borrow money from this bank. If you have any assets, you can't borrow. This was put together by Mohammed Yunus. He's in Bangladesh, and he looked around him after getting a PhD here in the United States in economics and realizing that all the economic theory that he had learned didn't apply one iota once he got back home and looked at all the productivity that was going on and the level of poverty that was going on. And so he developed something called the Grameen Bank, where you have to be poor to borrow the money, and they have a 98% return rate. Credit unions and local banks, state or city loans, community ownership. We need to have new systems of exchange, bartering in time banks and local currencies. I think people probably know what bartering is, but time banks, it's like accumulating money, only you accumulate time that you trade off for other activities. So for instance, perhaps you're a gardener and I make business cards, and perhaps, I don't know, you're a barber. Okay, you know, and so we work out through time the different kinds of exchanges that we can do. Also, local currencies. The Berkshires in Western Massachusetts is one of the best known local currency in the United States, as well as Ithaca Hours right down the road. We need to get taken care of things in a different way. Community repair days. A lot of communities now are developing a day where you can bring in a something that gets repaired. It might be your toaster, it might be a lawnmower or whatever, but people knowing how to repair things. Instead of having a throwaway society where you throw away everything from the latest watch that you got that doesn't work anymore to people by putting them in jail, you do something, you know, valuable with people and with things. So community repair days, gifting activities. I do this all the time. It's something I'm not using anymore. What do I do with it? I put it out on the sidewalk, and you know something? It always goes, right? It always goes. Whether it's a chair or a blender or whatever, it goes. Neighborhood lending systems, shared tool sheds, or the tool sheds, and then small appliance and cooking equipment libraries. And we need to relocalize life. That doesn't mean that we never go anywhere, that we never get something from somewhere else, but our lives need to be more localized. And this broadens the concepts of what it means to have a real economy where people are at the center and not profits. It creates opportunities and pathways. It democratizes social and economic interactions and encourages inclusivity, social diversity, and social justice. We're not going to have a viable future without the last of these things. It also grows vital networks, promotes neighborhood and community building, reintegrates people with nature, and brings sustainability and resilience into everyday life. You know, I tell my students all the time, everything that needs to be done is doable, but only if we change our thinking and behaviors to coincide with nature and do it quickly. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and now, Marcy, you're up.
Hey, I introduced you.
Oh, yes, you do.
Hi, I'm Ken. Some of you may know me by now.
I am Marcy Belfi, and I'm a professor here at Wells College in the Department of Education. And I'm going to talk to you today about engaging millennials in big picture issues through the use of instructional technology. So how many of you are professors right now? Okay, so looks like about half. So half of you are in other sectors. So this may only apply to half of you unless you go and you give presentations as part of what you do. So this could apply to lots of different audiences. So first we're going to look at what disengagement looks like. This is what we don't want. And then I'm going to share with you some current research on student engagement. And then we'll talk about instructional technology, how you can use it in your classes, and I'll give some student examples. And then I will share with you some feedback of what students are saying from some techniques that I tried this past semester, and then we'll have a conclusion and wrap up. Okay? So first, what does disengagement look like? Isn't it awesome when you teach a class or you give a presentation and everybody shows up and you ask questions and more than just that one person answers? How many of you have that? You ask a question and only that one person raises their hand? Yeah, I don't like that. And people laugh at your jokes and they're interested in, maintaining eye contact. That's just wonderful. That's what we live for, right? When we teach. And isn't it horrible when you go to teach and half your class isn't there? And it's always, no, I won't say that, never mind. And no one raises their hands, or they're on their phones or sleeping. So let's talk about disengagement. There are about 6 from the study of Sato and Smith in 2017. Absences, people are just not showing up, or they come in halfway through the class, or they're late. Unresponsiveness, that's where you ask the question and nobody answers, or you just have that one student always answering. Neglect and forgetfulness. So they show up to class, they don't bring their papers, they don't have the readings with them, forgetting assignments and deadlines and things like that. And then indifference. Sleeping in class, daydreaming, not taking notes. They're just not really there. They're sitting there, but they're not really there. Oops. Inaccuracy, this shows up in the end products where you give an assignment and clearly the student didn't actually read the directions on the assignment, even though maybe you went through it with them in class. I give weekly questions over the reading, and some students will just answer what they want to answer, and not really what I ask them, like, did you read or did you not, So that's inaccuracy. Maybe they're just not, they're not doing everything that they're supposed to do for the assignment or not paying attention. And rudeness is the one that I hate the most, where they're just, they're talking to each other in class, or they're ignoring when you ask them, please be quiet, or just sitting there. I had a student, and she would show up sit in the front row, always on time, did everything great for the whole class. She's just, I'm not kidding, right at me, just it was just horrible. I mean, she was an A student. What can I do? So those are the things that we don't want to see in class. So let's talk about engagement and how we can get students more engaged in these big picture issues. And wow, on my screen it displayed beautifully. So just try to ignore that. So I've conducted a literature search in the past 5 years. I was looking at studies that specifically showed student engagement, what we can do to get students more engaged. And studies that I found used survey methodology, student surveys, interviews, and focus groups. So that's the kind of data that I gathered. Let's see. And over looking through all of the responses and categorizing them, 4 main themes emerged from all the different ones. So these are the main themes that we'll look at a little bit more closely. So the first one is instructor dispositions. Students overwhelmingly are more engaged when they have a caring, passionate, and enthusiastic instructor. So our disposition is one of the biggest factors for student engagement. The second one is individual attention. Students really want individual attention from their instructors. They want the instructors to be personally interested in them, and that goes a long way to promoting engagement. And the third one, students want to have opportunities to interact with instructors who are knowledgeable, approachable, and well prepared. And what is approachable? Anybody have any ideas on that? They didn't really go into detail saying that, but how can you be approachable to your students? Yes?
Office hours.
Office hours! You have to actually be there, right? And have your door open. Anything else?
Tell them to call you by your first name.
Oh, call me by my first name. I don't know. That is very approachable though, yes. What else?
Try to set up meetings individually with each student, even if it's only 5 minutes to make that connection.
Yeah, I try to do that. I try to make it mandatory. Everyone has to meet with me one time in the first couple of months. I really didn't have a way to enforce that, but it did help a lot. Yeah.
When you say individually, I actually found it often, especially the first time, to meet in small groups.
Small groups, yeah.
But because they get the individual attention, you could listen to them, you'd answer their questions, but there'd be some reinforcement.
Yeah.
And then they'd go away, they'd have new friends.
And I like that a lot because building that classroom community is really important. Students like to get to know each other in the classes, and oftentimes they need an excuse to be able to talk to each other, right?
How big a class are you talking about?
Sorry, what?
How big a class are you talking about?
Well, you know, I guess it just depends. Yeah, it does depend. I don't have any classes this large. My largest class would be about 22 because we're a really small university. But yeah, that would be a factor if you had a big auditorium. That would be difficult.
I was a graduate, did you call me?
Yeah.
I was a graduate professor. My chairman came to me and said, I got a problem that somebody teaching global, which was our freshman introductory environmental course, quit, and he asked me to do it, and I said no, but then I did, and I loved it. And I would teach 120 students.
Wow.
And I want anybody who's a teacher, who cares about this, who knows a teacher, to email me and ask me about materials and syllabi and whatever for this course, and books out there, of course, there's got two of them. But the important thing, I think, is to get the students to read, which is tough.
Yes.
And then to talk about the reading.
Yes.
And the way I do it is go see the movie The Paper Chase.
Okay.
And what I would do is I would start the first 10 minutes of my freshman class, 120 students in a class, but I had a classroom where you could walk up and give the fisheye to every single student. And you ask them questions, and if they got it wrong, but had done the reading, and you can find that out pretty easily,
Yeah.
no problem, no problem. You know, but what's the main point of the reading? Da, da, da. But if they hadn't done the reading, they went on my shit list, and that's what I called it. And when they're on the shit list, they get called every day until they have shown me that they're doing the reading.
I hope you got something different than
I had
that.
hundreds of evaluations saying, my God, I hated this class when I first came in there, but when I got used to it and did the reading I was supposed to,
Yeah.
I found out that I loved it. And I don't know what the ones that didn't love it.
How many pages did you ask them to read per night?
Chapter, a chapter, that big thick book out there, a chapter a night, more or less. And we also use guns, germs, and steel to, you know, make it kind of fun, and sometimes signs and all kinds of things.
Did you have a comment?
Well, Charlie, are you done or no? Are you done or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Charlie wants to come up. Charlie wants to come up.
I don't think I was ever on the shit list, thankfully. Learn your students' names.
Yes. Yeah. And what a challenge in 120. Okay, Kim was
I
next.
got to tell you this. Take a piece of paper, divide it in three, and have them write their name and put it there.
That's what we do. Yeah, I do that every class. Yeah, Kent?
Yeah, not all meetings should be formal and scheduled and set up. Sometimes the best conversations are in the hallways,
Yeah.
or walking across the grass, or down by the lake, or
Yeah.
invite your students to conferences.
That's good. Yes?
With meet and greet, I have them do an introductory survey, and it's not just like, are you a freshman, what's your major, it's like, where's your hometown, and what's your favorite food, so that when we meet, I can discuss more things with them than just the curriculum.
Yeah, that's great. I used that to find out, I found out 3 students in my class were from Texas, which is where I'm from. So I love doing that. Like, oh, you're from Texas. Okay, let's talk. So that goes right into having a relationship. Students want to have a relationship with their instructor, and they want to talk about topics other than class. Yes?
I taught a class, 18 students, and I started each class with a question like yours. And they wrote down their answer in 2 or 3 sentences. And then they passed you roll the dice, and they passed their paper so many digits to the right.
Oh.
And then you had somebody else read your answer.
Oh, I like that. And did you have their name on it?
No?
No.
Well, everybody knew it was.
Everybody knew, yeah.
But the fact was, they knew that their answer might be the one that's read.
Oh,
as
yeah.
The answer to the.
And I like to start, especially in the beginning of the semester, I'll start the first few classes with an icebreaker. Just something totally, not related to the class to get that spirit of community. And that would be difficult in a big auditorium-sized class. So. But you can be creative. Yeah. Okay, so those are the instructor dispositions that came up through the literature. So second category is prep, and I made this category because these are the things that came up that you're not really doing in class, but you're doing it to get ready for the class. Students really want study guides. They want handouts from the materials that you go over in class. They want review notes for exams. So that's one. Second one is really big. They would like to have short blocks of information presented at a time. I don't know about you all, but for me, sitting in a class for my graduate degrees, they're all 3-hour blocks. And after 20 minutes, man, I'm gone. I need to doodle, I need to have snacks to eat, I need to be sitting with my buddies, and I just need something different. I cannot just focus. And so what I did this last semester, while I was lecturing, after every few slides, I would put up a quiz time. It would be a special slide of a game, make it like a game, and I would ask either a question from what I'd already covered previously, or I'd ask questions as a preview for what I was going to cover. And students are supposed to come to class already having read the material, so I could tell really fast, did you read, did you skim, did you really understand? And then I got feedback at the end of the semester, and students really liked that. At first, they were kind of a little bit stressed out. What do you mean quiz? I'm like, it's just for fun, it's not for a grade, calm down. And then they really liked that because it broke up the lecture into stuff. And so the last one for prep, students reported that they would like to have an emotional connection to the course content. And this can be done through personal stories that we intersperse throughout the class. A lot of you probably really like telling personal stories, and it's easy. For me, I was a teacher, and so in my field is education, so I had a lot of stories to tell. I was a special education teacher, and I worked with some really violent kids with behavior problems, so I have a lot of interesting stories to tell. Students really like that. They like it when you're passionate about the topic and you can tell the funny stories, so it's not just, here's what we're learning from our reading, things like that. So those are the two categories. The third one, this is the largest. This is in-class engagement. Students reported that they really like having in-class and hands-on activities. And so I'm just going to read you some examples of these. So you could have student presentations, peer critiques, debates, team projects, service learning, field experiences, demonstrations, simulations, or case studies, case method approaches. You can do a lot of those things. And there's a higher level, let's go to the next one. You can also do interactive games and quizzes, and these sort of go hand in hand. All of these sort of overlap with each other. Higher levels of engagement were reported when instructors use games and quizzes. So this is kind of similar to interspersing quiz questions in the lecture slides, but you could have teams participate for points, and that would be fun. You can use free online technology. I'm going to give a demo in just a little bit of one of the ones that you can use online. Number 3, students really want teachers to teach to the visual learning style. I can attest to that. I can't really remember just hearing people talk. My mom, she'll give me directions over the phone somewhere. I'm like, Mom, I don't know what you're talking about. Send me a map, draw me a picture, show me something I can see, then I can remember it. If I see it written down, if I write it down myself, I'll remember that. So you can use video and audio to capture and maintain students' attention. I tried this also, just putting in 2 or 3 minute video clips that go along with what I'm talking about. Students really like that a lot. So the fourth one is working in small groups. Students reported they like to work in small groups and have background music playing. And so the use of cooperative learning and project work can also promote higher order thinking. And so this leads us into, my number started over, that's actually number 4. So number 5. Students really expect to talk more and hear from others. They want to hear, they want to share their experiences and share their viewpoints, not just hearing us talk to each other. And I actually got this feedback this past semester. One of the students said, for my discussion-based class, she really enjoyed hearing what others in the class had to say. So the last one, oh, it just cut off. But that's it, you can see it. The last thing, students really want what we teach in the classroom to relate to what's going on in the world. And so this goes back to the big picture issues that we really want students to care about. How can we bring what we're doing in the classroom to what is actually going on in the world? And better yet, they would like it to relate to their own career goals. So I had this one student, and I talk about her a lot. At the beginning of class, she told me, "I hate your class." Oh, thank you. Why would you tell a professor that you hate their class? That's bad. I said, what can I do? You know, what can I do? This is like after the first day. Kid, you're interrupting my story.
Okay, but just tell them if you don't piss somebody off, you're not doing your job.
I don't work on that. I don't work like that. I want everybody to love me. So, like, what can I do? She's like, nothing. I have to take this class because it's a requirement, you know. And I said, well, you know, I want to make it fun, you know. And she said, well, I want to be a doctor, and I'm not interested in education. So I made it my goal to make my class relevant, to relate what we were learning to her career. Because it does. We're, you know, education and the medical field, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot. And by the end of the semester, she wrote me a really nice evaluation. And so I did my job. All right, that made me happy.
But did it turn everyone else off?
No. I wasn't just teaching to her, because she was the same one that was this the whole time, you know. So, no. And the last category is outside of class. So these are events that are part of your class but don't necessarily happen within the 4 walls of the classroom. Students really like having a field trip. They report there's higher levels of engagement when you can have a field trip in your class. This goes back to making it relevant to what's going on in the outside world. I don't know about y'all, but growing up, wasn't one of the field trips the best day ever? Unless you've had one of those bad ones where something terrible happened, but you get really excited about field trips. So do students. And then online learning is a really big deal. Students really want schools to help them make better use of online learning. They're on their laptops a lot. They reported that online quizzes help them better prepare for the class. They like to do media learning, and they want schools to figure out a way to incorporate technology more into the class. Okay, so technology, let's talk about technology, and we're going to do a little demo now. Okay, media learning at home, yeah. So, how many of you have ever done Kahoot before? Woo! Yeah, not everybody, that's good. Everybody's going to raise their hand. Everybody's going to already know this, so I'm glad that not many people have. So we're going to try it out. This is something that's so easy to set up, and you can use this in your class. You can use it in a huge class, in a big auditorium. And so what I would like for you to do is first to find 2 or 3 partners. And I know you hate to mingle and get to know everybody, but group up in groups of 3 or 4 if you can. Just get close together. You'll do better, I promise. It's a competition, okay? So you want to get together with a few people. Don't be on your own, okay?
We can dominate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next thing you need to do.
Be with you just a second. We can finish it. Projections and going to my job.
So you need, is there a microphone? Is this thing working? You need to figure out among you who has the best phone or tablet. Whoever has the best phone or tablet, you want to go on your mobile browser to kahoot.it. Pull up the browser on your phone and go to kahoot.it.
No website.
Only one person in your group needs to pull this up, okay?
The other one. I don't even know what.
Kahoot.it. I'll write that
Is the
on
bang
board.
part of it?
Kahoot.it.
Well, is the bang part of Kahoot?
Sorry?
Is the bang at the end part of the name? Kahoot?
No, no. There's no exclamation, okay? It's Kahoot, Kahoot.it. And you have to come up with a team name. Decide what your team name is going to be.
We just use it online. You have to download it.
Just go to the browser on your phone.
The gang of
It's coming.
You stick it in the game pin?
Here's the pin. 12565. Wait, but you should only have one phone per team.
Yeah, are you going to do it?
Yeah.
What, you want me to do it? Yeah, we can't do it.
Actuary?
There is only one phone per team.
Okay, so we got.
Now you want nicknames?
Yeah, the actuary.
There must be one teacher. You teach
Some of you are having trouble connecting to the internet. Anyone have a suggestion? Use the Wells Wi-Fi guest if you can't get in. Right?
We're there.
It's links network.
You know? Energy return.
Are we ready?
Mama revolution.
Are we ready?
Is that you, Jack?
Can we get started? We can go. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and start the game. Okay? Are you ready? Yep. Yes. It's coming. In what country would you find large ancient geoglyphs known as the Nazca lines? Nazca.
It's asking for a game.
Oh, pin. Does anybody know the pin?
126. 956.
Put it in.
Time's
Time's
up.
up.
2495.
Is that 8 correct?
Did you hear that?
Write it down.
You gotta be fast.
8 correct answers are 8.
Everybody got it right? Unless, except for the two that didn't.
We got it right, but we.
Does anybody know the pin?
Yeah, we can.
What pin?
1249565.
1249565.
Okay, so there's another question?
Will it let you join?
One chunk, right? One maximum size chunk.
I either know it or not. So we're one down.
Did you all want?
Test myself every.
Okay, we're gonna go to the next question. Okay, so Red Sox is in the lead. Followed by Mama Bird. Did I say that right?
Oh, it's a speed.
Back row, gang of four.
Go Sox. Okay. So it's a time fixture.
Yes, it is time-based. If you get your answer in first, then you get more points.
That would be useful.
Sorry.
Yeah, because it's just learning curve here.
So, yes, learning curve, yes. This is the first time I've done this with a picture. Okay, ready for the next one?
We're ready.
The world's fastest growing plant is a species of what?
Excuse me.
Oh no!
Speaking as a PhD in biology.
Okay, is this wrong?
A bamboo does not double its biomass in one day, and many species of algae do that.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't say if it's a sprint or a marathon, so we don't know.
Okay, yes.
It doesn't say if it's a sprint or a marathon.
These are all trivia questions I got.
I mean, who's the fastest human, a marathon?
Let's move on. I don't know. I see it. What is this wrong?
We know we're right.
That's not the point of this. Thank you. Okay, back row has taken the lead. Followed by Wells 101 and then Red Sox. Try to make it. There are only 5 questions, by the way. What is the official language of Greenland? Moving on. Back row is still in the lead. Who was the first president that was born a citizen of the United States? This is the last question. Florence Nightingale, 86 and wounded during which war? Okay, so that was fun.
We want to catch up. Keep going.
Rematch.
I did this with my daughter, and she's like, "Can you make another one? Can you make another one?" It takes time to make these quizzes.
But we are technically correct because algae is better than bamboo.
That's
Yeah.
what we thought.
I can see.
I love kelp.
Okay.
Okay, so.
Anybody have a memory of taking a test growing up and you got the answer wrong, but you knew it was right?
Yeah.
Happened a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so
Did you pick the questions and the answers?
Do what?
Did you pick the questions and the answers?
I just went online and looked up trivia questions relating to science and the world,
So if
I was
the
in a
trivial
hurry.
answer was wrong, you wouldn't know.
Well, I tried to look it up on Wikipedia, but I think the issue was the definition of fast. So, but I gotta be fast here now because I'm out of time now. So let me just wrap it up. I was going to show you, and I don't have time for this, but I did an experiment this past semester using some engagement techniques with my students where I let them, instead of writing short essays for their weekly questions based on the reading, I let them create a website, and I show them a lot of different apps that are free. So Poplet, S'more, Canva, I let them use graphics, video, audio, cartoons. I just left it wide open. And students loved it. I was going to show some of their stuff. I can mail out the rest of my PowerPoint. So this is pretty much the end. I was going to share some feedback. Students really liked being able to make their own products and have a choice with how they answered questions. Damon?
You could let IT know about that too, so they know what to answer when the students come to us with questions.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, how do I use Poplet? Poplet really is cool. So let's see. Spend time getting to know your students. Create opportunities for group work and classroom community building. Provide opportunities for real-world problem solving beyond the classroom. And explore the use of technology and have fun with it. So, questions? We're out of time, but if you have a question, you can ask me.
We're gonna get together after and.
Okay,
So
great.
thank you so much. Okay, we're running a little over, so I'm gonna ask that we have a really quick coffee and bathroom break, stretch break and so forth for 7 minutes. Let's try to get back here in 7 minutes, okay?
Wish me luck.
Thank you very much. That was fun.
And making an end run around that information system is extraordinarily difficult. Here's one approach I've taken, and I want to share it with you. I don't really care if I get through my slides. I have attempted to condense an hour-long talk into half an hour so I can give you sort of a meta version of the talk, more for your discussion and comment than anything else. I want to understand from you what you think the best techniques are for getting the public's attention, for offering information to them in a way that they will be able to retain. And so I called this subject a taxonomy of efficiency. I'll explain in just a minute. The questions that I'd like for you to ruminate on as I speak are, how does one best convey the importance and urgency of the situation to a general audience? And how does one even get them into the room? And something that has struck me over the years, even when I've been very successful at filling a room with 60 to 100 people, is that those in attendance are self-selected to really not be the ones who need to hear the message. How do you get the people who aren't going to come? That's really an oxymoron, isn't it? But that's a dilemma that I think has to be addressed somehow. For 11 years, I've given an annual talk during Earth Week. I call it my Earth Week rant. I thought that that was vague enough to enable me to talk about anything I want, and I also thought it was provocative enough that it might bring people in. I think it does some and probably turns away others, I'm not sure. This year, for my 11th talk, I decided to try to focus less on the input-output way of thinking about our economy, thinking about inputs and hence resource depletion, thinking about outputs, hence pollution, hence CO2 and climate change, and more to develop a foil within which I could then talk about anything I want. And over coffee with my friend Tom, I chose to talk about efficiency. I'm not an expert on efficiency, except possibly the way an exterminator is an expert on insects. But I have ruminated on efficiency and come to understand that it's a word that invokes positive feelings in us and oughtn't always to. I started my talk with the parable of my wheelbarrow. My wheelbarrow, which was a gift from a friend who moved to California and found it inconvenient to take it with her, began to fail after a number of years. Its handles rotted, and I decided to repair it. So at long last, I found a pair of handles that were made well. They only cost about half the price of a new wheelbarrow. I drilled them out so that they would actually match the bolts on the wheelbarrow. I ground out the rusted bolts from the wheelbarrow so that I could actually get access to the holes in the wheelbarrow to replace the bolts. I went and bought hardware. I took apart, cleaned, and painted the wheelbarrow, reassembled it, and the whole thing didn't take me much more than a day. And the cost to me was not much more than half the cost of a brand new wheelbarrow, which I could have gotten at the Home Depot and reassembled. So this was an extraordinarily inefficient use of my time, particularly as I'm actually a pretty highly paid 10%er at a liberal arts college in the United States of America, right? And so it was one of the many things that got me to thinking about what efficiency really is. From a resource use perspective, of course, this was efficient. I bought 2 new handles and some hardware. I didn't throw away or cause to be recycled that huge piece of steel, and I saved a lot of material that is of value, and it's still in use in my garden. So that's my in to thinking about efficiency. Efficiency is thought of sometimes as the antipode of resilience, and here is a blog post by a person who is trying to fight against that notion. If you read her post carefully, you find that she's simply redefining efficiency to be whatever it is that isn't against resilience. And I'm going to take a slightly different approach and just examine efficiency from a very straightforward, simple point of view, and then make some commentary as I go. So here's the approach I shared in my public lecture, which I gave 3 times, once to the physics colloquium. I work in the physics department at Wesleyan University. Once to the public in an evening lecture, and once to my science colleagues in our Friday luncheon. and I have some gloss to give on that at the end if there's time. Efficiency can be thought of as a ratio. You use some stuff, you get some stuff, right? And if you get more stuff than you used, you have good efficiency. If it's the other way around, it's poor. But if you think about it, efficiency takes a variety of forms. The kind of efficiency I call commensurate efficiency is an apples and apples efficiency, where what comes out is of the same sort as what went in. Energy efficiency is a perfect example of that. Thermodynamic efficiency for a physicist is the fundamental kind of efficiency. You have a source of energy in the form of heat energy, and you're able to divert some, but not all of it, to do useful work. So we define thermodynamic efficiency as work energy output, heat energy over heat energy input, and we have a dimensionless number that cannot be greater than 1. In fact, it must be less than 1 by an amount that involves the ratio of the cold temperature to the hot temperature, that is the reservoir temperature to the engine temperature. If you think about it from an engineering point of view, that's the maximum possible efficiency. And it immediately points out that if it's uniformly hot everywhere, then no useful work can be done because you lack that temperature differential that permits the flow of energy. I then show a Sankey diagram of the United States energy economy, and I make a point that it's 32% efficient, and this so-called rejected energy, which is most of the input energy, of that wasted energy, that's a real nice euphemism calling it rejected, of the wasted energy, much, if not most of it, is second law losses, that it are required by the laws of thermodynamics given the processes that are being undertaken. I have never found a way to concisely tell the public who have no physics background what the nature of the second law is. This is one of my current efforts. I've condensed it as much as possible for you. I'd be eager to know if you have other ideas. Ways of increasing efficiency of this first kind might include making a combined cycle power plant where you take the waste heat from one power plant and use it to fire an entirely other power plant, and you can increase efficiency by doing that. And we have one of these combined cycle gas-fired power plants in Middletown where I live. More about that presently. Efficiency also takes the form of fuel efficiency, and it's regarded as something important. For one thing, it would allow us to have more cars if they didn't use so much gas, each one of them. And unfortunately, the consensus is not uniform that fuel efficiency is important. I think it's very entertaining that it's the Wall Street Journal that I found defending the CAFE standards after they were set back this spring. And of course, energy return on energy invested is, for this group, the canonical sort of commensurate efficiency. I showed my audience this beautiful graph that not only illustrates the losses of energy at each point in the extraction, refining, and transportation, and ultimately usage cycle of petroleum, but also makes the point, if there's time to discuss it and if people are interested, that where one draws the boundaries is an extremely important determinant of what one gets for a number. I showed this net energy cliff graph to the group because this is something that everybody needs to see, even though it's a little contrived, plotting along two axes different forms of the exact same thing. But it does put in perspective different kinds of fuels and their possible contributions or non-contributions to society's energy needs. And at this point in my talk, I wanted to make because there are different kinds of energies available, I wanted to talk about fantasy a little bit and some of the things we tell ourselves that may save us. And one of those is epitomized by this lovely little article I found online, in which it turns out that if you install turbines in your sanitary sewers, you can reclaim a little of the energy that was used to pump the water to the households as it flows downstream toward the treatment plant. And somehow that could power entire cities. I suppose if New York City had these, they could perhaps power Aurora, but I think that's about the extent of it. And so we talk a little bit about downcycling of energy and again, the second law. While we're talking about waste, or thinking about it at least, another kind of efficiency is that efficiency that allows us to make invisible to us some of the less desirable outputs of our households and of society. And is it efficient to use drinking water to flush waste down to the treatment plant, or is it efficient to collect it in bins like this and transport it to the treatment plant by truck? Well, it would actually be most efficient to treat it on site, but think about the nightmare, the public health nightmare of allowing millions of citizens in a city to treat their own waste. So this is a real conundrum, right? And as we think about a future of less fossil fuel energy, dealing with the human waste of cities is a very serious problem, and probably a more resilient city will be the one that manages its waste this way, because it'll be able to figure out a different way to transport those blue bins to perhaps more localized treatment facilities once trucks are no longer available for that purpose. These are the kinds of things that the foil of efficiency gives me the opportunity to talk with my audience about. And the audience is typically pretty engaged and willing to interrupt and ask questions. And so, again, I don't always get to the end of these presentations, but it gives me a chance to have a conversation with people about things that they don't ordinarily think of. By the way, I probably forgot to say, please interrupt me if you have anything you'd like to say, comment on, correct, or suggest. Please, yes.
Tucson
Yes.
allows the use of human waste.
Uh-huh.
So we can compost it on our own property, use it on our own property.
That's fantastic.
And you can put it in buckets and let it sit for a year.
Or you can buy a clivus or whatever, what have you, right?
Whatever.
Yep,
There's
There's all
composting
kinds of ways of
programs.
composting
And
human
we have
waste, that's right.
the watershed management group in Tucson, and they teach the classes, and they have a little sticker that says Mother Nature called, she wants her crap back.
Right. That's very good. That's very good. The whole idea of taking the nutrients from our food and as efficiently as possible putting them into our rivers is the most, or what we do in Connecticut is we collect them, we screen out as much of it as we can before the tertiary sewage, still not potable, is put into our rivers, and then we burn it. It's not legal in Connecticut to compost that, so we burn it. And do we make energy from the burning? No. Not that it would really matter, but we don't even do that. So, having gone on this little digression, you can see that efficiency could be misleading, because if you're able to externalize some of the impacts or the costs of your process, you can fool yourself into thinking that you're very efficient, when in fact you're very efficient at damaging someone or something else, right? And so this way of making a misleading scope is extremely important and valuable to those who either intentionally or otherwise want to mislead us. It makes invisible the negative impacts of our human activities, and it spreads the cost among many, which it makes possible, though it doesn't guarantee, the concentration of the benefits then for just a few. In other words, it's the tragedy of the commons. So let's move on to type 2 efficiency. I'm sure to run out of time. Type 2 efficiency is the one that's really scary. This is apples and oranges efficiency, where the benefit is of a different kind than the cost, and consequently there's no really good way to draw the line, and there's no really good way to even define it. But we all know it when we see it. If you use less time to make a widget, right, then that's more efficient. So let's take a little look at that. If you reduce the inputs, that's one way of increasing efficiency. That's doing the same with less. You could call it parsimony or cost cutting. And as I reflected on what would entail reducing inputs, I realized there are some things that just can't be made more economical by that mechanism. For example, a cake. You need a certain amount of flour and sugar and shortening and water to make a cake. And then I thought a little more. I thought, well, you could cheapen the ingredients. You could use high fructose corn syrup, and you could fluff up the cake with air and make it be just as big but have less cake in it, behold the Twinkie. Yes, Ken?
Tom Douglas production function tells you that all inputs are substitutes.
I'd love to have a minute with you to talk about Cobb Douglas function.
Air is a good substitute.
It is, it's so nutritious. We'll also come back to Twinkies if time permits. So a way of reducing inputs might be offshoring and automation. In fact, it provides jobs. This is a seasonal workers camp in Nevada. These retirees migrate to the vicinity of the Amazon warehouses each winter to help with the Christmas rush. So, in fact, this is the kind of work that is now required of people. Twinkies themselves were resurrected by firing all the workers, getting rid of the unions, and automating the process. So Hostess had had a relatively backward kind of production technique that involved lots of labor and paid the laborers well. Perhaps that's the future. The World Bank seems to think so. Other ways of reducing inputs would be cutting corners. If you're a golfer, you know that it's really not appropriate to just leave lying your divots. It's important to replace them promptly so that they can be reintegrated with the turf. That memo never made it to the petroleum companies in Louisiana, which dig channels for their pipes for the refineries and then do not fill them in, thus destroying the wetlands, making them more subject to storm surge damage and ultimately degrading what little bit of those wetlands is remaining and might be a buffer for the coastal cities of Louisiana during storm events. And of course, corner cutting involving finding a cheaper and less, and it turns out incompatible source of water with Flint, Michigan's pipes is another example of corner cutting, which seems efficient at the time, but turns out not to be. Who could have predicted that? Corner cutting in the case of the combined cycle power plant in Middletown resulted in a practice that it turns out was pretty common. When you blow down the gas lines prior to commissioning the power plant, you need to use some gas, and well, the pipes are already full of natural gas, so it's very convenient to blow down the pipes with natural gas. The welders never got the memo that the blowdown was occurring, and the plant, which was days from being commissioned, exploded with tremendous loss of life, and has now been rebuilt and is in fact
What year was
working.
that?
It was about 6 years ago. All right, well, you could try doing more with the same if you don't think it's appropriate to...
That's increasing efficiency because you're reducing the numerator.
That's decreasing efficiency if you reduce the numerator. You want to increase the numerator and reduce the denominator, making that ratio get bigger and bigger.
There's less electricity used because you
changed it,
killed
definitely.
some of the electricity used.
Save that for the end, Charlie. So, I hope you're all familiar with the Palco story. I went on about it at great length in my hour-long version of this, but you may know that Charles Hurwitz got junk bond funding from Michael Milken to buy out the Pacific Lumber Company, which had enormous holdings of old-growth timber in the Northwest. It had made some terrible blunders, namely, it had not properly inventoried its trees, and it had gone public, therefore making itself vulnerable to a hostile takeover. But it did some things right also, which turned out ultimately to be its undoing too. Namely, it paid its workers well, it practiced relatively sustainable forestry practices, being a generations family-owned business that wanted to continue to have this increasingly valuable old-growth timber for into the future, since all of the surrounding lumber companies had eliminated their old-growth holdings previously. Suddenly this timber was extraordinarily valuable. It was undervalued. Hurwitz recognized it, bought out the company, forced the board of directors away, and proceeded immediately to liquidate the holdings being trees, and this was the result. Eventually there was a public outcry that is well documented in a very thick book that I could recommend to you. And thanks to public outcry, now a tiny little vestige of the old growth has been preserved as the Headwaters Grove in a forest preserve that was created. It's the only forest preserve that the United States government owns. Here's an aerial view of it. You can see the little clear cuts embedded within it. It's really sad, but of course it's just part of a trend of eliminating old growth forests throughout the continent and actually throughout the world. We could pause here, and I would, in an hour-long version of the talk, to discuss that too, but instead let's move on to increases in outputs. So you can just make everything go a little faster, right? In fact, we have something called worker productivity, which is touted as a great measure of how much better workers are. I like that the word worker is in this. Workers become more productive usually by being eliminated, right? If you make the denominator smaller, then worker productivity goes up, meaning you're not requiring as many workers any longer to do it. And if for some reason productivity fails to grow the way you expected, this headline, so it looks like it's blaming workers to me, right? This headline was published, again, by the Wall Street Journal, in a quarter when worker productivity went up, but it had been forecast to go up by more, and that was regarded as slipping. It's just unbelievable to me, the stuff that goes on out there. Pardon?
It's because pot was legalized.
Well, that may be what's necessary to keep the last workers able to sanely continue to work. So I just thought I showed a couple of clips to the students and to the audience. Whoops, where did it go? Play, please. There we are.
Section 5, leave it alone.
And I won't show the Lucille Ball sketch, but do I get 2 extra minutes? Okay, but then you get my rant about Lucille Ball.
All right, girls, now this is your last chance. If one piece of candy gets past you and into the packing room unwrapped, you're fired.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello!
Well, this is easier. Yeah, we can handle this, okay?
Now, I hate to ruin the fun, but in the few short years between Modern Times and Lucille Ball, job switching did not send the message. Of course, it was comedy above all, but Modern Times was a radical leftist production. Job switching taught the message that, Lucy and Ethel had switched jobs with their husbands, and the husbands were staying home and attempting to cook. And the lesson learned was that the women's place is in the home and the men ought to be back on the production line, where I'm sure they wrap the candy just right. So this goes on and on. You could do more with less, right? That would be even better. I think of that as delusion. I'll rapidly go through these slides because I'm rapidly running out of time. But the Dust Bowl, of course, was, among other things, caused by putting into production marginal land to feed a growing population. It involved 5 states. If you are not familiar with the work of Alexander Hogue, who was an extraordinary painter, kind of along the lines of, I'm failing to bring his name to mind.
Grandma Moses?
No,
Diego Rivera.
well, that's a good, yes, that's not who I was thinking of, but yes.
Picasso. Hopper.
All right, thank you all, but we'll move along here. Anyway, and Dorothea Lange's classic portrait of a Dust Bowl woman. And so to prevent this from happening again, you know, we can learn from our mistakes. The county soil and water conservation districts were created. These are quasi-governmental organizations that provide land use planning services to municipalities and to farmers, and with the hopes that making such mistakes wouldn't be repeated. Now, the tiny pittance that these organizations get from state governments is being cut as the wave of state government insolvency engulfs the nation, and so their future is at risk. Because after all, what could go wrong? We've had a generation to forget the lessons of the Dust Bowl. Fracking, I don't need to tell you about. For one thing, you know all about it, and for another thing, Charlie described it very ably yesterday. But the public narrative, which most of the people who come to my talks aren't familiar with, is that you know, fracking is a petroleum renaissance. Look, gas in my town was down to under $2 not that long ago. It's over 3 now, but the frackers won, right? Though if you look at the cumulative net free cash flow of the entire Bakken region, you find that it has made a tidy negative $35 billion in its entire existence. Of course, you have to reinvest to eventually realize the benefits, but sooner or later you'd better start realizing the benefits as you consume the petroleum from the sweet spots. The oil majors are not immune from this, and this graph shows the trend in the net free cash flow of the top 3 U.S. oil companies and the blossoming of their debt as they too have been forced to use unconventional means to secure petroleum. Coming back to EROI, it's becoming better measured and it's becoming better known, but again, not to the public, that the energy return of the resources that we are exploiting is getting lower and lower as time goes on. You're probably familiar with Brian Check. He's been at these meetings before. He wrote a great book called Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train that, among many other things, talks about the liquidating economy in which we take resources that are non-renewable and liquidate them, or take resources that are renewable and consume them at a rate faster than they are able to be replenished. And this cannot end well. But all the public sees is a graph like this one showing that we win! Tom Murphy has a blog called Do the Math. He's a professor of physics at the University of California at San Diego. He also has been at ISBPE meetings. And he points out that we have to be careful if we want to deploy energy to build ourselves an infrastructure that doesn't require fossil fuels, lest we get to the other side of the peak and find that we're just running faster to stay in place and have no surplus that we can use to build that alternative infrastructure. That time is now, right? I mean, the few short years that are provided to us by the petroleum from fracking are maintaining global petroleum production at a level that probably isn't going to be seen again. I'm not going to predict that there's no other fracking technology out there or that there's no other field in the world that can't be exploited, but that too will extend the day of reckoning just for a short period of time. And so in a rather real sense, we're burning the furniture at this point, aren't we? This isn't working perfectly, but you catch my drift. So, of course, a whole talk could be based, I know where I got this idea, on this remarkable graphic just showing the impacts, the growing impacts. And I know, it never struck me to take out the energy piece of this and use that as a focus for a talk the way John so beautifully did yesterday. I hope you were all here for John Shramsky's talk yesterday, because that's the model that I aspire to when I write talks, having something clear and clean, that if you have time, permits you to embellish, but if time is short, you can go through and make a single point. That's not my goal with this talk, but that is a model for all of us. In this talk, I left out almost all of the doom and gloom stuff, believe it or not. That is to say, documenting the destruction of the coral reefs by the bleaching events, documenting the deforestation of Indonesia, documenting some of the extreme impacts that are occurring, was omitted. And one of my colleagues had the temerity, and he's been to my talks before, to quibble with me about the potty flushing thing and whether maybe that could be scaled up. And because I didn't force upon him the recognition of the magnitude and scale of the problem. So even PhD scientists faced repeatedly with these facts, if not reminded every single time, will let their techno-optimism get the better of them, right? That's pretty much what my physics, chemistry, biology, etc. colleagues at Wesleyan are professionally. And we write grant proposals. We have to explain how we'll be able to make a better bomb with the technology we're able to develop. And so it's daunting and it's very discouraging. And so I will close. How am I doing for time? I have another minute? That's fantastic. So this quote was mentioned yesterday and is a really important way of thinking about our blindness. And I asked a colleague in the classics department to craft for me a slightly different saying, which I'll translate for you in a moment. And this is what it seems to me the complaints against our message boils down to when it comes from economists, politicians, etc. They say, with their togas on, non factus est, ergo fieri non potest, which means it hasn't happened, therefore it can't happen. But with a little more time, I'd talk to you just a little bit about the great cycles of the world's civilizations and about what happens in between them, which is not necessarily pretty, certainly not at its outset. And so instead, I omitted that material and just talked about doing less with less. Because that's what we have to do, isn't it? That's what we're going to do, whether we choose to do it or not. We're going to do less with less. And as we think about survival, we need to move, as we acquire more knowledge, from thinking about risk to benefit ratios to, as Dmitry Orlov points out in this really interesting, provocative, and difficult book, thinking about harm to benefit ratios, right? If we increasingly know that harm, whether it accrues to an individual or not, is going to be done by some activity, then that ratio is important for us to attempt to assess, and the activity should not be permitted. And sorry, this means regulation, doesn't it? If it will not benefit someone. And then, of course, I can go on, which I won't, making the point that, in fact, the externalization that most of the world's biggest industries undertake to make themselves profitable, if internalized, would render them unprofitable. That harm makes them basically a blight upon the planet, although a very large-scale and powerful one. So I'll leave an image of Low Tech Magazine up here. If you aren't familiar with it, there's all kinds of terrific articles on this blog. Maybe I should just go on ahead to this last slide. Nicholas Fox, who ran a little bookstore in Maine, was a self-styled Luddite who wrote a book about the Ludd movement and who wrote this article for the Washington Post some years back. It wasn't entirely successful. It was attacked, in fact. But she simply pointed out that efficiency isn't always what it appears to be. Thank you. Sorry I ran over.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you. Okay, so next up.
Fall of 1969. And as a freshman in college, I took a course in economics. And it was the worst course I could possibly imagine. And at the end of it, I swore to myself I would never take another course in economics. It was a course in microeconomics that I now teach. Right? So I then, to reward myself for managing to get through it, loaded myself and my buddies in a van and headed south through Salvador's area, through Sonora and through Sinaloa, and to go surfing in Mazatlan. And I came back to find out that my draft lottery number was 20.
Head for Canada.
No, it's too cold. I was ready to head back. I had a place all picked out in Mexico to go. But I was faced with the dilemma that I got the last year of student deferments, but I had to have 15 credits. And so my choice really came down to another economics course or Vietnam. At which point I thought, this is what they mean by opportunity cost. And San Diego State had 38,000 students. This would be a tiny class there. But there was so much overload, they brought in an adjunct from the local community college. And I went from the worst class I ever had to the best teacher I've ever had in my entire life, from kindergarten through graduate school. His name was Will Cummings. And on the masthead of his syllabus was this quote from Mikhail Gibran. The teacher who is wise does not bid you to enter the house of his wisdom, but rather lead you to the threshold of your own mind. And I have spent an entire career as a teacher trying to emulate Will and trying to avoid that microeconomics class. Like Marcy was saying, the completely unengaged teacher. Did anybody ever have a teacher who you knew was bored with the subject matter and resentful for having to teach?
Yes.
Those are the worst. So my big question becomes, what does sustainability mean? I know I founded a sustainability major, but it's like one of the most vaguely defined things that I can imagine. Like, sustaining what? And as an economist, I think we can either sustain the process of capital accumulation, make money, invest it, grow bigger, make more money, exploit more labor, remove labor with machines, make more money, put it into financial assets. We can sustain that sometimes, not always. They call those periods where you can't, recessions and depressions or long-term stagnation. But the problem is the system in overshoot can't grow its way into sustainability. So economic sustainability means grow. Environmental sustainability first means degrow, which means getting smaller, and then a steady state economy, which means staying small. So to me, the two things are pretty incompatible. So I try to engage students to think about big picture issues. Not quite as well as Marcy, but maybe you want to scare them a lot. Like, what would the world be like if there wasn't enough electricity to run your cell phone? Like, what would you do? There was a horrendous thunderstorm that came through and knocked out all the power. And after the storm passed and the sun came out, all of the adults were acting as a community. We were picking up each other's lives, we were talking to each other, and all the kids are like, what do we do? So what kind of new skills would you have to get to manage your life? Or maybe even important, what kind of old skills that have been forgotten will you have to rekindle in order to manage your life?
Unintended with the Kindle part.
Yeah, unintended. But, I know that weather isn't climate, and you can't put together conclusions about climate from a single weather event. But at the same time, we can't avoid looking at patterns. And, the patterns are there. We had sub-zero winter temperatures. There was a 20-degree anomaly in the Arctic Ocean that steered the cold wind down here. But remember, in the Arctic, that a 20-degree anomaly is still 40 below zero, and when all that channels down here, what do you mean global warming? It's so cold. But we've had the hottest year ever, and every year is the hottest year ever. And we had torrential summer rains. The beautiful lake you see was green by the end of the summer, because it rained and it rained and it rained. And you'll notice that if you've driven around the area, there's a lot of farmland. In fact, there's more cows in Cayuga County than there are people. And ever since they classified concentrated animal feeding operations as point source pollution, farmers just spread the manure on their fields, and all the nutrients wash into the lake, and so we get what they call harmful algal blooms. Of course, really cyanobacteria. But so there's all of these things that, Puerto Rico was devastated, as was much of the Caribbean. So, are these things unique, one-time event, acts of God, or are they the new normal? Or maybe the new normal is there is no normal. What does it mean, and what can you do to change it? That's my question, because Jim Kunstler, who's spoken here before, put it so well. What we're seeing is just the outer bands of a shitstorm that we are not prepared for. What can we do about it? And I always, when I teach my class, try to put that emphasis on is what can we do about it? And when you put questions 1 and 2 together, what's your life going to be like? Will there be the cell phone app that says climate remediation that you can push and then lead a comfortable life? Or just what? Imagine. That's what I try to get people to do in class, is to imagine. Wells is a liberal arts college. One of my favorite parts of teaching history of economic thought is my section on Malthus. And the reason I like it is I begin with a Shelley sonnet. People know that Malthus wrote his essay on population as a reply to William Godwin and the Marquis de Condorcet. And William Godwin's daughter, Mary Godwin, got married to Percy Shelley. And they went on vacation, but it was the year Mount Tambora exploded, putting so much sulfur dioxide. It was the year without summer. So they went off on holiday and it did nothing but rain. So they said, let's write a ghost story. And Mary Shelley was the only one who came through. So I read a sonnet by Percy Shelley, and then I go through Malthus, and I end by deriving a differential equation for population growth. The perfect liberal arts experience. So since you're in a liberal arts college, you get a poem. And this poem is by Drew Dellinger. And it's from Hieroglyphic Stairway. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake. Because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in my dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing and the mammals, reptiles, birds were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? Well, I think most of us in here know, and so what are we going to do? There was a time back when I kept my student deferment that I would be a little bit more militant. When we found out that the Naval Electronics Laboratory was producing plastic fragmentation grenades that wouldn't show up in an X-ray machine, and then we're shipping them to Camp Pendleton and then to Vietnam, there was a point when I laid down on the freeway to stop the shipments. And there was a time when I occupied the nuclear power plant in Seabrook, New Hampshire. As I've gotten a little older, probably gotten a little less militant, that jail is not such an exciting experience anymore. But what I do try to do is not only to transmit knowledge, beckon people to enter the doors of wisdom, but rather try to find ways to lead people to the threshold of their own mind, to think, how is it going to affect your life? And I once had a student tell me what I was supposed to do, make him get rich. Where I said, I don't care. My job is to get you to think of profound thoughts about things you wouldn't think about at all in my absence. And so here's what I'm doing. And what I would really like to find out is what other people are doing, because I'm not always effective. Marcy had talked about not showing up. Dana back there was the student who would always raise her hand and was one of the 6 people out of 23 who regularly showed up. So I'm not getting to everyone. So here's what I'm doing, and tell me what I might do a little bit differently. Please. So here's what I see. Actually, I put this together. I'm now a 67-year-old academic, but how do I convey a love of complexity in a world where people crave simplicity? And how do I transmit this need for a holistic understanding in an age of specialization? And how do I transmit this abiding love of nature when nature is absolutely frightening to me? I learned that when I was going to graduate school in New Hampshire, and friends visited from New York City, and we were walking along the road, and there was a sound in the woods, and people were fundamentally, what's that? Squirrel? Maybe a raccoon? Give me the South Bronx or Bedford-Stuyvesant at midnight any time, but this is really frightening because nature just isn't flower gardens and ambling through the wood. Nature is hurricanes and tornadoes and drought and wildfire. I think much of the use of fossil fuels has been to remove us from nature, to give me a nice climate-controlled rooms that have no windows in them, which certainly couldn't think. This is one of the few things that has chalkboards, because I think in terms of energy use, chalk is cheap. I think it's also more effective because instead of having an event, things go up in process. And if everything is already there on the slide, there's no place for the students to add anything. And so, I too am a real believer in low tech, of course, except for public presentations. Jim Kunstler once said, "You people have no idea how boring you are." Nobody wants to read a PowerPoint slide full of bullet points, so I'll get rid of this one as quickly as I can. One of the problems about sustainability is often the problem is just too big to wrap your mind around and to wrap your arms around. And it also entails rethinking and questioning what you've learned that you don't have to question, which you can just accept as part of your birthright as a middle-class person. What do you mean I should turn the lights off when I leave the room? But you know, it's not just personal. It's not just somehow my comfort and convenience is more important than how the Earth's biophysical systems work. And of course I should be able to write, and well, the next generation, they're going to be richer than we are anyway. That's certainly what economists teach us. I have to calculate net present values to show you that. But the also thing is that it's systematic. On the microeconomic level, economics is all about efficiency. Although we don't use these simple, we have Pareto efficiency, where you can't make anybody better off without making anybody else worse off. I have no clue as how anybody would possibly measure that. Or we can have allocative efficiency, where resources flow to the best use. But that can only happen in perfect competition, which is, you know, kind of like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. It's kind of a nice idea, but doesn't exist in the real world. So, but even though microeconomics might be all about efficiency, macroeconomy is all about waste. If we did not have copious amounts of waste, the economy would stagnate to a much greater degree than it is already. I know we're all supposed to have 5 and 6 and 7%, or sometimes financial institutions will demand 40% growth rates, but if you look back to the Civil War, we've grown at less than 2%. Stagnation is the norm. The 60s were the anomaly, but yet that's what we're supposed to assume. So if we produce this stuff, because we get more efficient and because we can throw fossil fuels at production, then we can't sell it, then we stagnate. So I have a friend who's a marketing professor, and he puts it really briefly that what marketing is all about is you sell people a bunch of stuff that they don't need and don't want, and convince them that their life will be terrible if they don't buy it. So next time they'll come back and get it voluntarily without you having to put any money into it. But that's incompatible a system that has to perpetually grow and have to produce more stuff and have to throw it away and get something that's new and improved, that's incompatible with living within our biophysical limits. But yet, as my friend Julie Shore wrote in her book Born to Buy, that we are bombarded from the time we are walking with images. And you know, there's boy cartoons and there's girl cartoons, and it's now hard, if you have young children and watch cartoons, to tell the difference between the advertisements and the program. And I know one of my daughter's favorite ones, Rainbow Bright, was so sickeningly sweet that you're almost happening that G.I. Joe comes along and sticks her with the bayonet. But the other thing I've learned, and it comes from teaching in a liberal arts college, that logic and evidence don't motivate everyone. That, you know, my psychologist friend tells me that the Olympic system completely overwhelms the rational system. Yet as an economist, I live in this world of abstract logic and evidence, and how do I reach people and bring them along to maybe just consider that maybe it's not your way of doing everything, but it's worth taking a chance on. I think there's limits from an academic upstream that, and I remember when I went into my kids' kindergarten. Anybody remember kindergarten? I mean, what do you see? What do you see? The kids are loud. They're moving around. They're talking to each other. They've got smiles on their faces. They're having fun. And then you walk into a class of high school seniors. Man, what's a class of high school seniors? Are you walking around and playing with physical objects and having fun and talking to each other?
There's remarkably less of that.
There's remarkably less. Right, you're all of a sudden studying for the test. You're not studying to know anything or apply anything. You just have to take the test. I think they call that no childness. Then there's what I call the scourge of postmodernism. Right, that it's more individualistic than the modernism it criticizes, and I think it's led to this ethos of all me, all the time. That somehow my identity is more important than how the Earth system functions. Well, there's a role that social media plays. That people know about FOMO, fear of missing out. So the idea that you could walk into a class and for an hour and 15 minutes just pay attention seems to be more and more missing. Maybe Marcy's right. Maybe I shouldn't try to do anything for more than 20 minutes without a break. And plus what Juliet Shore had written about Born to Buy. So there's a lot of things that are beyond our control in the classroom that students just come in already having inculcated into their, but this has been said. There's declining resource quality, there's climate change. Robert Gordon had written about, you know, the slow growth rates. Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy wrote about, you know, the role of waste in absorbing economic surplus. And plus, one of my favorite economists, John Kenneth Galbraith, really kind of put it down in his great book, The Culture of Contentment, that somehow the economy is built on convenience. Now, of course, most of the world's population is left out of that, but we're supposed to believe that convenience is our birthright. And I know we're supposed to grow, and if you look at things cumulatively, every one of those blue bars is a recession, but it's roughly exponential. And that's what pressures the environment. It's a cumulative amount of carbon in the atmosphere. It's the cumulative amount of resources that have been extracted. It's the cumulative amount of waste that builds up. But then if you look at growth from another perspective, from year to year or percentage growth, that's what it looks like. There's a lot of variation, but there's a slight downward trend. Now, this is the one that employment depends upon. So that puts us in a unique dilemma. We're growing too fast to live within nature's limits, and we're growing too slowly to provide employment. So you can't be too fast and too slow at the same time. So this creates a great policy dilemma. So usually what I do is go through all kinds of measures of overshoot. Have people ever seen this before? No. And then you can go put GDP growth onto it and say, hey, maybe there's a connection between energy use and the economy, or maybe we can look at how much oil we're using, conventional and non-conventional, and we're getting more and more of our energy from, I've seen a biology professor talking, you know that humans are the only species we know that drill down to 10,000 feet to get energy? And it's limited. And then in Nature, a journal which David Packer is familiar with, in 2004, Johan Rockström and his team that also included Will Steffen and James Hansen came up with a set of planetary boundaries. And those red lines are the ones we've exceeded. Biodiversity loss and disruption of biogeochemical cycles and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And some of them we're getting closer. Land use change is a nice way of saying deforestation. And some things we really haven't quantified yet, chemical pollution and ocean acidification we're getting out there, and stratospheric ozone depletion. We almost wrecked the planet, but then Paul Crutzen and Sherwin Rowland and Mario Molina figured out what was happening, and we could actually change things. But we could step back from that, because getting rid of chlorinated fluorocarbons' ability to deplete the ozone could happen by a technological change. You could add hydrogen to the mix. Boom. Technology will save. Of course, there is that problem by adding hydrogen makes it another really powerful greenhouse gas. And so there's often unintended consequences of technological change. And there's the Earth's recent climate history. And what I point out, people, is what the period in which humans evolved, the Holocene, is unusual in its stability. That's what we've got, is unusual stability. And then I'm going to show you a couple graphs that I can go through quickly, because I think you've seen them before. The great acceleration of exponential growth and everything. But the question I ask people is, how compatible is this escalating exponential growth with this stability? And how long can we keep doing what we're doing before we disrupt the stability? What that means is just reordering not only your own thought patterns on how much resource use you deserve, but also it means you have to think about what the economy is like. I once asked my students in the 1980s, which would you prefer? Global thermonuclear war or socialism in America? How many people? It was about 2 to 1 for global thermonuclear war. So just rethinking the economy in which you live is asking really a lot, and doing it in an era of having less, and having less permanently. I'm really asking people a lot. What I'm really asking is to ask people who may be struggling themselves to cut back in order to give a little bit better life to a child in Africa a couple generations from now? I know I ask a lot of people, but my job is to make people think profound thoughts. And to me, that's about the most profound thought I can think of, is to get people to think not me now, but humanity in the distant future.
1 minute.
So the problem is we live with all these myths. Charlie and I pointed it out in Energy and the Wealth of Nations. I think one of the big myths is prices are determined by supply and demand. Most prices are administered. You know, tuition here isn't determined by supply and demand. The board gets together and sets the price, and you either pay it or you don't. Yep, the vibrant growth is the norm. It's a myth. Or the idea that technology will save us. So clean energy. But, you know, as Charlie said, that each one of those wind turbines takes about 300 kilograms of neodymium. And where does that come from? Well, most of it comes from China. So first you mine the ore, then you devastate the agriculture. Oh yeah, then you gotta remove the ore, basically by using coal. And then you have to put it in a container ship and send it across the Pacific, burning bunker oil. And then you go through the Panama Canal and up the coast and into the St. Lawrence River and down Lake Ontario to Oswego, where you put one blade at a time on a truck and drive it out 100 miles to Fenner, and now we have clean energy. So I'm not of the belief that technology will save us. And, you know, there's hydraulic fracturing. It's already been talked about. And, you know, all you got to do is to figure out how long hydraulic fracturing will last is look at the depletion curves, and it doesn't tell a pretty picture. And, you know, there's Bakken, and those are the fundamental dilemmas. Capitalism has to grow. The Earth systems won't retain any more growth. If we don't grow, we stagnate. If we do grow, we risk the, either we stop growing voluntarily, or nature's going to tell us we have to stop, both in terms of lack of fuels but I don't know. How do you find a politician that's got the courage to stand up before the electorate and say, I'm going to have a policy, if you vote for me, I'm going to reduce the amount of resources you have access to, and to preserve things for the poor of the world and the next generation. Please vote for me. I don't see that within our system. So, finally, even though we have been pressuring, there's a lot of human needs that are yet met. I mean, people are, as Franklin Roosevelt said, ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-shod, don't have jobs, work for low wages. So the question is, how do we meet human needs while stepping back from the planetary boundaries? Kate Rayworth, who works for Oxfam, said, how do we find the donut? That's what I'm trying to do. I'm not completely sure how to do it, but there's a suggestion. When does growth stop making us better off, and when do we enhance our lifestyles by cutting back?
Thank you so much. Okay, we have, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great. We have one more very